At this point, we've reached a time where we have written most of our routes for both our orders as well as our authentication. Now we're going to go ahead and test these endpoints using unit testing. So I'm going to be using the unit test module that comes with Flask as well as Pytest, which is going to provide for us the test runner that's going to allow us to run these tests. Now let's get started. So I'm going to go to our code, and within our code, what I'm going to do is to create a folder. So I'm going to create a folder within our API project. So I'm going to call this tests. And within our test, I'm going to create our init.py to label this as a Python package. So I'm going to come here and say new file. So this is going to be our init.py file. And now after creating this init.py file, I'm going to go ahead and create other files. So I'm going to create one for testing orders and another one for testing the user endpoint. So this is going to be for testing orders. I'm also going to go ahead and create that one for testing our users. So I'll call this test users. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be implementing our test case classes that are going to be from Unittest. So Unittest allows us to create these test classes that we are going to write. So for example, I'm going to start with a test of users. So I'm going to import Unittest. So I'm going to come and import unit test. And after importing Unittest, then we're going to make use of the test case class that comes from Unittest. So let me actually enlarge this a little bit and close this. So I'm going to create my class. This class is going to be the one for user. So I'm going to call this the user test case class. And this is going to inherit from the unit test case class. So we're going to say unit test dot test case. And right after doing this, then we're going to go ahead and write teardown and setup functions. So teardown and setup functions are functions that run each time we run a test. So for example, if we needed to like initialize our database as well as get rid of it, then we need to call these functions. So what I'm going to do is to write these functions. So I'm going to start with our setup function. So I'm going to say setup. So it's going to be setup. It's going to take itself for now and just going to simply pass it for now. I'm going to also create a teardown function. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say teardown. So this is actually going to be a teardown function. And right after creating our teardown function to also take itself, and we shall just pass this for now. Now we also have configuration specific to our app in testing, and we're going to set those up. So I'm going to go to our project, and within our config, so I'm going to go to our config folder, and within our config.py folder, we have a class that basically defines the testing that we want to, the kind of configuration we want to use for our testing. So I'm going to close this, and when we come to our test config, we're going to set up what we want. So we're going to be using an in-memory database for our testing because we do not want to create a separate database for testing. So I'm going to be using SQLite that can also run in memory. So we're going to first set up our database URI. So I'm going to remove this. And before I actually do anything, so I'll have to tell Flask that is running in a test environment. So I'll set up testing, and I'll set testing to true. Right after setting testing to true, then I'm going to copy some of the settings we have here. So I'm going to copy the SQL Alchemy settings, and I'll come right here and I add them. So I'm going to come right here, also specify that I want to keep my debug. Actually, let me leave debug to true. So I have the following settings. Now the first setting we're going to change is the one for our database URI. So right here I have an SQLite database URI pointing to an SQLite 3 database. But what we want in this case is to use an in-memory database. So what I'll do is to remove all of this. And the way we can specify that our database is going to be in memory is by simply giving SQLite this database URI. So this basically means that we're going to keep our database in memory. And right now we're going to keep our track modifications false, so we shall not be able to track any modifications in our database schemas. We're going to keep our SQL alchemy to true so that we'll be able to monitor which SQL is generated each time we do anything on our database. Now, right after having these configurations, then we're going to go ahead and set up our app. So I'm going to go to our test users.py, and within our test users.py, we're going to call our create function that we created within our API. So let's go back to our folder. So when I go to our folders right here, within the root of our project, we have an init.py file that has the create app function. So the create app function is is the point of our application that actually helps us to create multiple instances of our application. So what I'm going to do is to come right within our test users. I'll import our create app function. So I'll say from. So since we're using packages, in this case, I can access our API folder by saying dot. In this case, it's going to go 2 steps backward from the current folder we are in. And in this case, I'm going to just say import our create app. And this is because the create app function is located within the init.py file or in the root project folder of our application code. So right after doing this, then I'm going to go ahead and set up our app. So I'm going to come right here in our setup function, and I'll say self. So I'm going to create a class variable. So this is going to be our app. And in this case, it's going to be the instance or the instance of our create app function. So we're going to use our application factory to create an instance of our app, but in testing in this case. So I'll just say is equal to create app. And now when you go back to our init.py file, so I'm going to come right here. We have this create app function taking in a config. So right now it takes this config from the config dict, and by default it's our development configuration. So when you go to our config right here, so I'll go to config, and when I go to our config.py within our config folder, we have a config dictionary. So this config dictionary gives us keys that allow us to use the different classes. So in this case, we want to actually access the class for testing. So to do this, I'm just going to get the testing key, and when I come right here, I'm going to come and specify config. And in this case, our config is going to be the key of testing. So I'm going to import our config dict. So I'll say from dot config. And in this case, we're going to actually enter the config module as well. So we're going to import our, so in this case, I'm going to import our config dictionary. So I'll say config dict. So I'll just come right here and then try to reference the key of testing. So in this case, we're going to actually access the class for testing. And right after doing this, then we're going to go ahead and push this to an application context. So to do that, I'm going to come and say, we're going to actually create an application context first and then push this up to the application context. So I'm going to remove this. And what I'll do is to say self dot. In this case, I'm going to say app context. So this is actually going to be self dot app. In this case, we shall say dot app context. So in this case, we want to create an app context. So I'll just add this to an app context. So I'll say app context. And right after creating our app context, then we want to push our current app to our app context. So what I'll do is to say self dot. So in this case, it's going to be dot app context. And then right here, I'll just come and say push. If you want to see me make a video about different application contexts and what this is all about, please leave it down in the comments. I'll be pleased to make such a video. So let's go ahead. So after creating our application context, then I'm also going to create a test client that's going to give us the ability to test our API. So I'll just come right here and say self dot. In this case, I'll say client. So I'm just going to call it client. And this is going to be our test client that's coming from our app. So I'll just say self dot app, and then I'll say dot. This case is going to be our test client. So right after creating our test client, then we're also going to create our database using the configuration that we define in our configs. So right here, we actually configured our API to run with our test configurations. I'm going to go ahead and set up our database. So I'll have to inherit our DB instance or our SQL Alchemy instance. I'm going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say from dot dot. So I'm moving to, actually this is going to be dot dot 2 steps backward, and then we shall go to the utils folder. Then we shall access the DB module, and then I'm going to import our SQL Alchemy instance, which we named DB. So right after doing that, then we're just going to call db.create also that to create our tables. But remember, this time we're going to actually keep our tables in the database. So in a database, it is actually going to be in our memory. So after doing that, I'm just going to come right here, and I will say db.create all. So this is actually going to go ahead and create our database tables. And right after doing that, then I'm also going to go ahead and test our and write our teardown function that's going to run each time we are done with our test. So this is actually going to destroy our database tables, destroy our database, and actually set all these to none values. So after doing that, I'm going to just come right here, and the first thing we shall do is to destroy our database. So I'll say db dot, in this case I'll say drop all. So I'll just simply say that we want to drop all our database tables. And right after dropping all our database tables, and I'll come and as well set the app context. So I'll pop the app context. So I'll say self dot app. So in this case, it's going to be app context, and I'll say dot pop. And then we shall also set our app to none. So I'll say self dot app, and this is going to be equal to none. So right after doing this, then we shall also set our client to be none. So I'll actually come and say self dot client, and in this case, it's going to be equal to none. And right after doing this, then we're going to go ahead and write our first test. So we're going to test our endpoint for our user. So let's go to our users view. So I'm going to go to our views of users, and I'll actually access those from our authentication. So I'll go to views.py within our authentication. And right here, we have all views specific to our authentication namespace. So the first view we're going to test is one for creating a new user or signing up. So what we have here is when we create a new user, we expect to save this user to our database as well as to return a 201 created status code. Now I'm going to come right here. So I'm going to close this for now. And what I'm going to do is to write a function. So I'm just going to come right here and I'll say def, and this is going to be a test. So I'm going to call this. So if you're observant, we are going to be writing our tests as functions that begin with test and then the functionality. So for example, in this case, we're going to test uh, user registration. So I'll actually call it test user registration. And right after calling this, it's going to take itself. It's going to act on every object of our class. And then we're going to write the logic that's specific to testing that particular endpoint. Now, Flask gives us the test client that gives us the ability to make requests to a certain endpoint. So we're going to use our test client. Now, I'm going to create a response variable, and this is going to be equal to the response that we shall get after using our client to make a request to the auth sign up route. So in this case, I'll say self dot. In this case, I'll say client, and then this is going to be a post request, so we expect to post. And then we have to specify the URL as our first argument. So in this case, our URL is going to be the URL that we actually make a request to in case we want to register our user. So right in here, I'm going to come to our views.py within our order, our auth. And then what I'm going to do is to copy our URL, which is on the slash sign up endpoint. So this means that our URL is going to be slash auth. Let me actually close this. So it's going to be on the slash auth slash sign up endpoint. And right after we have this, now let me check for clarity. So this is going to be on the slash sign up endpoint. And once we have this, then we are also going to pass in the data that you need to send as part of this request. So I'm going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say data. And this case is going to be a dictionary containing the different data that we want to pass into this. So we're going to have a username. So let me actually say that our username is going to be a test user. Now we're going to also have, let's say, an email. So we're going to have an email. So I'll say our email is going to be test user at, so we shall say company.com, and then we shall also pass in our password. So in this case, I'm going to actually pass in our password, but it's going to be a password hash. So to save this as a password hash, I'm going to be making of Workzook's two security functions. So I'm just going to come right here, and I'll say from Workzook dot security, I'm going to import our generate password hash function. So this is basically going to save our password as a password hash or an encrypted text. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to add our password. So actually have this as password. Now when you check this, so what we need to do is to actually send this to our database. So I'm going to say that what we want is to send this password as a hash. Let me actually send this data as our password. So this is actually going to be our password, and then we shall maybe pass in our password here. So let's actually first test this with our data. So I just come right here, and I'll specify that we are sending our data as JSON. And right now we're going to specify that our JSON is going to be our data. So the one thing that we need to test is by using our assert keyword. So the assert keyword helps us to test whether our values are as we expect them. For example, we can get our response status code here. We can say assert, and then you can say response dot. In this case, you can say status code, and then we equate it to, so we can be able to check if it's equal to a certain value, such as, so in this case, we say 201. So when I save this, we expect to get an error in case this does not bring true. In case it returns false, we're going to actually return an error, or if it actually returns true, then we are going to actually have our tests passing. So we're going to go ahead and install Pytest. That's going to provide us with a test runner that's going to enable us to run this test. So I'm going to come within our terminal. So I'll go to our terminal right here. And what I'll do is to stop our server. I'm going to come and say pip install. So this is going to be Pytest. So I'm going to install Pytest within our virtual environment, and it's going to help us to actually run our test. Now, after writing our test, we're going to go, after installing Pytest, now that our Pytest has been installed, we're going to go ahead and basically add it to our requirements.txt file, as well as run our first test case. So I'm going to clear our terminal with Ctrl L, and then I'll freeze this to our requirements.txt. So I'll say pip freeze, then I'll freeze this to our requirements.txt. And right after freezing this, then I'm going to go ahead and run our server again. So run with Python run server.py. And after running this, then I'm going to go ahead and run our first test case. So I'm going to actually stop our server so nothing is wrong. So I'll just come right here and run our first test case with Pytest. So this will look for all tests written within our test folder, just like we've written them, and then go ahead and run them. So when I run Pytest, it's going to collect all tests, and then it's going to run. So we have our test failing. So what we have is our assertion error. So it seems like our database was created just like you see here, and our database was actually dropped, meaning that our setup and teardown functions are actually working. But we have an error in our code. So what we have is we actually have a 404 error, meaning that the route that we specified does not actually exist on our API. So I'm just going to come right here to our code and try to correct this. So we actually need to make this on the slash or slash sign up. So this actually has no forward slash. So let's try to actually make this request again. So when I go to our terminal right here, I'm going to try to test this. So it's going to collect our test case. So right now we see that our endpoint is working. We can even go ahead and test if this user actually exists within our database. So for example, we can come to our code right here, and the first thing we're going to do is, because we've created a user, then expect that our database is going to have some users. So I'm going to come here and make a query that's going to actually check if a user exists. So I'm going to say user is equal to, in this case, I'm going to import our user model. So I'll come to the top of our code here, and then I'll come and say from dot dot. In this case, I'm going to say models, and we're going to go ahead and import our user model. It's actually located in models.user. So I'm going to come and import this. So I'll say user. And right after importing our user, then I'll come right here and basically query if this user exists, and then we shall actually check if some attributes of the user are actually the attributes of the user that we've created. So I'll come right here and say user dot query. So in this case, we're going to use dot query, and then we shall filter by. So I'm going to filter by the email. So in this case, I'm going to check if the user with this email exists. So if our email is equal to, so in this case, I'm actually going to copy the email we used when creating the user, and then I'll just come here and say that you want only one object. So I'll come here and use the assert keyword. So I'll say assert, and then in this case, I'll say assert user dot username. So this is actually going to be, so let's say you want to test if this user has the name of test user. So in this case, I'm going to say test user. So right after doing this, I'm going to save and go back to our terminal right here. So when I go back to our terminal, I'll run Pytest again. So when I run Pytest, It's going to collect all our test cases. And now we see that our user has been created. So this means that our test for user registration is actually working. Now let's go ahead and also test our endpoint for actually logging in a user. So I'm going to come right here on our code, and I'm going to write another test case. So I'm just going to come right here and write a test case. So I'm going to call this test login. So right here, we're going to actually take in self. And after writing this, then we're going to also use our test client to create our response. So I'm just going to come right here. I'll have the same lines of code. So I'll basically have the same line of code right here. So we're going to have our response. So right here, we're going to actually send this to /auth/login if I'm not mistaken. So let's go back to our Swagger UI and refer to it. So our endpoint is actually /auth/login. So I'm going to come right here, and so in this case, we're going to send a request to /auth/login. So first we're going to have data containing our email and our password. That's going to come right here, and then I'm going to say that our data is going to be equal to, and in this case, we're going to have our email as well as our password. So I'm going to provide our email, which is going to be testuser@gmail.com. And then right in here, I'm going to go ahead and test. So I also provide our password. So our password is going to be password. So when we send this, we expect 200 okay status code if it has gone well, and we expect a 400 bad request if it has not gone well. So what I'm going to do is to actually make this request. So I'll come and pass an assert statement here. So I'll just say assert, and then going to assert if the response. So we're going to assert if the response status code so equal to 200, meaning that our request has been successful. And if it does not pass, then that means that our login functionality is actually broken. So I'm going to go back to our terminal right here, and I'm going to run Pytest. It's going to run our code. So right now our test has failed, and this is because we have a 400 error. So this means that our user actually does not exist within our database. So this means that our test is actually working because now we don't have this user existing in our database. So let's go ahead and also try to test some of our other endpoints. So I'm going to go to our code, and right here I'm going to go to our test orders.py. So I'm going to have the same procedure. I'm going to create a test case class that's going to help us to write our test cases, and we're going to actually tear down and set up our function, our database. So I'm actually going to import our unit test. Excuse me for this. So I'm going to import our unit test, and then after importing unit test, I'm going to create a class. So it's going to be our test case, and this is going to inherit from Unittest dot test case. So right after doing this, then I'm going to go ahead and set up our database. So I'm going to set up our tests. So actually this is going to be set up. So I'm going to remove some of this. So right here, I'm going to actually also remove this return type. Don't need it. So I'm just going to come right here and then state what we want. So I'm going to import our create app. I'm going to come right here and say from dot, we are going to import our create app function. Right after importing our create function, we're going to create an app based on this create function. So I'm going to say self.app is going to be equal to create app, and this is going to take in a config. So this config is going to be from our config dictionary, just like we did on our authentication tests. So I'm just going to come right here and say from dot. In this case, we're going to go to our config and then our config module, and then we're going to go ahead and import our config dictionary. So this config dictionary is going to have our key for testing. So I'll say config dictionary, and then I'll specify that you want the configuration specific to testing. Right after doing that, I'm going to go ahead and also set up our application context. So I'll actually remove that. So this is going to be self.app context. So this is actually going to be created from our app. So I'll say self.app.app context. So right after creating this app context, then we're going to push our app to the application context. So I'll say self.app context So this is going to be dot push. And right after doing this, I'm going to go ahead and also create our test client. So I'm going to say self dot client, and this is going to be equal to our Flask test client. So I'll say self dot app, and in this case we shall have test client. Right after having our test client, then we're going to go and also create our database. So I'll import our models. So I'll just come right here and say from dot models dot orders. We are going to import our order model. And then we are also going to go ahead and try to also access our DB instance or our SQL Alchemy instance. So I'll say from dot, and in this case it's going to be our utils. I'm going to import, actually it's going to be from .utils.db, then we're going to go ahead and import our DB instance. So right after importing our DB instance, then I'll go ahead and use our DB instance to create our database. So to do that, I'm just going to come below here and say db dot. So this will be db dot create all. So I'm going to go ahead and save this. So once I save this, then I'm going to go ahead and create our teardown function. So our teardown function, so it's going to be tear down. It's going to take in self, and just within here, we're going to actually first drop our database. So I'm going to say db dot drop all. And right after dropping our database, then we shall set her up to none, as well as setting our application context to none. So actually, we shall pop our application context. So we shall actually pop application context, then also set our client to none. So I'm just going to say set our client to none. And right after doing this, then we're going to go ahead and write our test. So to do that, I'm just going to simply come right here and I'm going to say def. And in this case, we're going to test the route for getting all orders. Now, keep in mind that these routes are protected. So we need the JWT to actually access these routes, as you're going to see. So we're going to say test get all orders. So this is going to be for getting all orders. And in this case, we expect to get an empty list of orders since we don't have any orders. So I'm just going to come here and say it's going to check itself. And right here, we're going to use our application client or our test client to actually make this request. So I'm just going to come right here, and what I'll do is to say that our response is going to be equal to self.client, and then I'm going to say dot get. Since we are sending a get request, if we are sending a post request, then you'll say post, put, delete, and so on. So in this case, I'm going to have dot get, and what we have is our URL for getting all orders. So when I go to our Swagger UI right here, that URL is for /orders/orders. So I'm going to write that. So I'm just going to come right here and I'll say /orders and then /orders. So right after doing this, since this is a GET request, what we need are the headers we're sending with this request. So keep in mind that this is a protected route, therefore we need a JWT to access it. So I'm going to create a JWT for a dummy user. So I'm just going to come and say that our token is going to be equal to, so I'm going to use Flask JWT extended to create this token. And I'll come right at the top of our code and import our Flask JWT extended. So I'll say from Flask JWT extended. So we're going to have import, and in this case we shall import the create access token. Sorry for this. So this is going to be create access token, and this is actually going to allow us to create an access token. So I'll just come right here and use our, we're going to use a dummy username to create, or a dummy identity in this case, to create our access token. So I'll say that our token is going to be to create access token. Now specify that our identity is actually going to be, let's say, test user in this case. So right after creating this token, then I'm going to also specify which headers I'm going to send with this request. So these headers are going to have the authorization header that will allow us to actually pass our JWT so that you can be able to access the content of that request. So I'm just going to come right here and say headers, actually going to be headers, and this is going to be equal to, so it's going to be a dictionary, and it's going to have a key of authorization. So this is just like we did in Somia while making the request. And then we shall pass right in here. So I'm going to call this an F string and shall have bearer and then our token. So this is going to be our token. So right after doing this, then let me correct this. So you need to have actually to pass this. So after passing our URL, then you can pass some extra arguments. For example, I can come right here and say that we are going to have our headers equal to our headers. So in this case, we're going to have our headers. Now after doing this, then we expect to get an empty list since we don't have anything in our database. Now to do this, I'm going to come and say assert. In this case, I'll say assert that our response has actually we're going to check if our response dot status code is equal to 200, meaning that our response is okay. And since we don't have anything in our database yet, we're going to also assert if it's going to return an empty query set. So to do that, I'm going to come and say assert response. So in this case, I can get whatever thing, for example, response.data, which is actually going to have the data of the response, is equal to an empty list. So when I save this, I'm going to go ahead and run our tests. So I'm just going to come to our terminal right here and I'll run Pytest again. So this is actually going to go ahead and collect our tests and run them. So right here, we have two tests failed and we have that one for getting all order. So let's actually see what happened. So when you go right here, we have, so this is actually 400. So this is actually the one for 400. That's because of the errors we have, because we don't have any user existing with these credentials. Now also have one for our, so let's actually see, uh, we have an assertion error. So test login and test orders. So we have our test failing. Let me actually check. So this is for test users. And now we have the one for testing all orders that's actually giving us that. So left contains three more items, first extra items. So basically we do not have any data here. So actually to access our data, what we needed to do is to access it with request. So I'll say response dot, in this case I'll say response dot JSON. So when I save this and try to run our request once again, I'll actually run our tests. So right now we see that only the test for our login is failing because we don't have a user. So let's actually try to create to actually fix this. So when I go back to our code right here, I can actually assert for it to be 400 since we do not have any error created, any user created in our database. So when I go here, I can actually assert our error to be 400, meaning that it's going to return a bad request error because then we don't have any user created within our database. So when I come right here, I'm going to run this. So run Pytest again. So right now it shows that all our three tests are passing. So let's go ahead and also test how we can create an order. So to test this, I'm going to go right within our order test. So right here in our test orders.py, I'm just going to come and write our test case for creating an order. So I'm just going to come right here and create this function. So I'll call this function test create order. And right after doing this, then I'll go ahead and say it's going to take itself. And right then I'm going to come and use the same thing like we've been doing. So I'll specify our data. So in this case, we're going to have a dictionary. So this dictionary is going to have the following. It's going to have the fields that is actually want when making a request for creating an order. So I'm going to go to our vis.py for orders and then be able to see those fields. So when I go to our orders within our views, we're going to go to our order model. So when I go to our order model, we expect a size, we expect an order status, we expect a flavor. So let's actually work on this. So when I come right here, I'm going to go ahead and do this. So when I go to test orders, we're going to have our size. So I'm going to come and say size. And then this is going to be, let's say, large. Then we're also going to have our quantity. So we're going to have quantity. And then we're going to have the quantity as, let's say, 3. Then we shall also have our flavor. So in this case, let's say any dummy flavor. So let's say test flavor. So Once we have this, then we need to send this as part of our request. So I'm going to come right here and create a variable called response that's going to use our test client to make that request. So I'll say self. In this case, it's going to be self dot client and then dot post because we are sending a post request in this case. Then what you need is to send it to the URL. So our URL is /orders/orders. So right after doing this, and I'll go ahead and specify that our JSON in this case is going to be for true. So our JSON in this case is actually going to be the data that we send. And then we shall also need headers because this is a protected endpoint. Now I'm going to copy some of the logic we have here for creating a token. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. So copy this and then paste it right here. So I'll pass our headers within our request. So I'll just come right here and say that our data is going to be, our JSON is going to be data, and our headers in this case is going to be for true, our headers. So when I save this, then we're going to go ahead and use our response to assert if our test actually pass. So the first thing we're going to assert is whether our status code will be 201 created. So I'm going to say assert. And in this case, I'll say if our response dot status code. So in this case, we are checking if our response status code is 201. So I'm going to say response dot status code is equal to 201, meaning that if our order has been created, then after doing this, I'm going to go ahead and save. Now when I save this, I'll come right within our terminal right here, and I'm going to come and run our test. So right now we see that our order has been created because our tests are now passing. So let's actually see what we're doing here. So we actually have our status code running. So we can actually also check if our order has been created. So for example, I can come right here and say orders is equal to. So in this case, what I can do is to actually query for all orders. So I can say orders. Actually, it's going to be order dot query dot all. And right after doing this, I can come and say assert. And then what I can do is to assert for len of our orders all our objects in our query set. So I can say len orders. Len orders is equal to 1. So right after doing this, I'm going to come and actually search for this. So let's say we wanted to get the length of our orders. So I can just come right here just to check if our database actually has some objects of type order. So when I say Pytest, it's going to run our tests, and now we see that our tests are actually running. So let's actually go ahead and see. So it seems like we are actually running only one test within our test order. So let's actually see this. So right now, we have a test order. It's actually an indentation error right here. So let me actually fix this. So when I'm going to indent this so that we have this on the same line, mistake that I did, and hoping that everything is fine now. We also expect this test case to pass. So when I go back to our terminal right here, I can come and say Pytest. And now we see that all of our test cases are passing. So this has given you a clue on how you can be able to test the Flask endpoints. So we've been able to cover how we can be able to write test cases with Unittest, as well as how to use Pytest to run our test cases.